Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 4th, 2021, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Clyde, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Minority Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on the subject of my special order.
Without objection.
Thank you. Madam Speaker, I'm proud to rise today in hosting a special order on the Second Amendment, which is both near and dear to my heart and is also near and dear to the many millions of Americans who cherish their rights and freedoms. The Second Amendment says, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Though it brings me great joy to talk at length about the Second Amendment and the foresight our founding fathers had to enshrine this God-given right into the U.S. Constitution, I regret that lawmakers today must still rise to defend it, a matter that was settled 230 years ago. But we must still do this because the Second Amendment is again under direct and constant attack from not just gun control activist groups and the left, but now from our very own government within the executive branch. The Founding Fathers enumerated our right to keep and bear arms in the Bill of Rights to ensure the people had the ability to protect themselves from a treacherous government that sought tyranny over democracy. Because we know, Madam Speaker, and our Founding Fathers knew as well that the first step towards tyranny is to disarm the citizenry. The irony is not lost on me that the Democrats in control today are trying to do everything they can to gain power and keep power through rule changes and enacting sweeping laws that will forever tilt the scales of that power in their favor. It was announced just this past week that Republicans and Democrats were able to strike a deal on an infrastructure plan, which was heralded as great news and no easy feat in this partisan body. But then the news broke that the Democrats wanted to add to the bipartisan agreement a vast human infrastructure proposal. What is human infrastructure? So now infrastructure becomes redefined to be anything they want it to be? So if you cannot get something done legitimately via legislation because you don't have the votes, then the new tactic is accomplish it by redefinition. Just redefine the meaning of the word. So when does this act of redefining everything as we know it stop? Madam Speaker, I fear that it won't. And I see that to be true when it comes to attacks on the Second Amendment, as the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms newly proposed rules on the definition of a frame or receiver and on pistol stabilizing braces makes that abundantly clear. Through these proposed regulations, the administration is attempting to unilaterally redefine what constitutes a firearm under federal law, and in doing so, restrict the rights of law-abiding gun owners. In some cases, the courts have not ruled ATF's way. So ATF wants to change the rules so the courts have to abide by new regulations more favorable to them. The ATF wants to increase their influence and authority and do it by edict, making it harder on law-abiding citizens to own firearms. They want a new definition for a firearm, one that will greatly expand its meaning and give ATF immense additional authority. It was Congress who created the law that defines a firearm. ATF does not have that authority. We have a separation of powers issue here that ATF wants to ignore. It seems they don't want the representatives of the people to have a say. No, ATF wants to make the change themselves and thereby increase their own power. This is wrong thinking, and it is dangerous. Before I go further, let me pause for a second and review the legislative history of our key gun laws. Congress passed the National Firearms Act, or NFA, in 1934, the Gun Control Act, or GCA, in 1968, and the Firearm Owner Protection Act in 1986. While two of these acts have since been amended, with the GCA amending portions of the NFA, the current definition of the term firearm can be found in the GCA under 18 U.S. Code 921 and has been effectively used for over 50 years. But the ATF has decided to expand its authority by proposing broad and arbitrary definitions of industry terms, including some that are not even referenced in the definition section of the current law, including the terms privately made firearm and complete weapon. It is one thing for an agency to use its regulatory authority to clarify terms included in statute for purposes of implementation, but it is clear to me that the ATF has overstepped its authorities by legislating new terms not even referenced in the statute. Under one of the proposed new regulations, a dummy receiver or an 80% lower would now be considered a firearm, as it would be covered by the grossly expanded definition of a frame or receiver. As you can see in the illustration right here, do you see the difference between the two? The top is actually functional. The other one on the bottom is a solid piece of block of metal with no ability to accept a firing mechanism, no hammer, no trigger, no selector, and so completely non-functional. Now let's look at those same two from the top-down view. Do you see the difference right here? The bottom one is a solid block of metal, but the top has been machined and has places for a trigger and a hammer and a selector. To make the bottom one work, you have to have the tools and the skill of a manufacturer. So let's take a closer look at the dummy receiver, Madam Speaker, right here. This solid block of metal doesn't look like a firearm to me, and it certainly doesn't work like one either. There's not even a hole right down here for a trigger. What's more, the ATF in its own rule noted that Congress recognized that regulation of all firearm parts was impractical back when this body was debating the GCA in 1968. And in fact, Congress moved to make the regulation of the firearms industry more efficient and functional by striking language in the term firearm that would have resulted in regulation of any part or parts of a firearm. Just like the bolt and the upper receiver, right assembly pictured here. They are not firearms now, but ATF wants to make this a firearm. But there is another aspect of this redefinition that will go completely unnoticed unless it is challenged. That is taxation. The more pieces and parts the ATF can call firearms, then the more excise tax they can collect. Let that sink in for a minute. Yes, this is another tax hidden in the price of a firearm. Every firearm manufacturer pays a 10 or 11% excise tax to the ATF based on the invoice price when they sell a firearm to a dealer. So through this redefinition, the government is going to make more tax money on the back of law-abiding citizens. And will Congress have passed a new law to increase taxes? No. The ATF will have created a new stream of tax revenue by simply changing the definition of a firearm frame or receiver. More taxation at the whim of ATF. The Second Amendment recognizes a right endowed by our Creator and codifies it into law. Taxation of a constitutional right is unconstitutional. But if this redefinition is allowed to stand, then this will only be the beginning of more and more taxation on citizens' gun rights. ATF knows that they cannot make the law more stringent without action by Congress, and they know that such support does not exist in Congress. So they try a flanking maneuver, an end run to bypass the legislative branch. They believe that they, along with gun control activists like David Chipman, can use the authority of the ATF, a law enforcement agency, as a political pawn to carry out their anti-Second Amendment agenda. And Madam Speaker, that is exactly what the ATF is doing as we speak. One day you have a perfectly legal firearm or part. The next day you wake up and your firearm is no longer legal as decided by ATF. Such legality must be left to Congress to decide, as it has done through the legislation I previously referenced, not decided by unelected federal bureaucrats that may soon be led by a radical gun control activist named David Chipman, unless my colleagues in the Senate oppose his nomination, and I trust they will. For I fear, Madam Speaker, that if my Senate counterparts do not thwart his nomination, we will have more redefining of words led by a partisan radical gun control activist. I call it legislation by redefinition. But this abuse of power can be stopped, Madam Speaker, and I invite you to join me in defending our rights by submitting comments directly to the ATF through the Federal Register notice. The two proposed rules I've referenced so far are available online for the public to read and have collectively received more than 180,000 comments so far. One rule is called Definition of Frame or Receiver and Identification of Firearms. The other rule is called Factoring Criteria for Firearms with Stabilizing Braces. Madam Speaker, I believe all Americans, especially gun owners, should inform themselves of the proposed changes and share their thoughts directly with the ATF through the public comment opportunity at www.regulations.gov, written right here. The public comment period will last for just a few more weeks, and I'd love to see the total number of submitted comments hit 500,000 for each proposed rule. I think every single member of this body agrees with my belief that criminals who misuse firearms and perpetuate violent crimes should be held accountable for their actions. And I'd also hope my colleagues would concur with my belief that law-abiding firearm owners should not be punished because of the illegal acts of a few who knowingly commit evil acts. But rather than focusing their efforts on punishing criminals who use firearms in the commission of a crime, my Democratic colleagues have instead chosen again and again to slowly chip away at the Second Amendment rights of law-abiding citizens. H.R. 8 and H.R. 1446 are prime examples of Democrat-led efforts to curtail American Second Amendment rights. That is why I introduced H.R. 1787, the Ensuring Safety Act, which would mandate the federal government respond to a background check in 3 calendar days and not allow them to delay background checks potentially indefinitely, as happened during the pandemic. And with that said, I'm thrilled to have so many of my colleagues join me in standing before you today, Madam Speaker, to speak in defense of the Constitution and the Second Amendment. And I now yield to our conference secretary from North Carolina 8, Representative Hudson.
Thank you. Madam Speaker, I rise a proud defender of our rights as guaranteed in the Second Amendment. Ever since I was a little boy, my grandfather taught me the right way to handle a gun. I've loved the outdoors and appreciated the freedom that comes from our Second Amendment. As an adult, I came to understand the Second Amendment is the right that allows us to defend all our other rights. Unfortunately, the Biden administration has declared war on the Second Amendment. In just the past 6 months, the President and my colleagues across the aisle have pushed numerous gun control policies that would have zero impact on violence but threaten law-abiding citizens. The most recent example is a proposed rule from the ATF to impose a new tax and ban on stabilizing braces. This proposed regulation jeopardizes the right of law-abiding gun owners, including disabled combat veterans who rely on these braces. In fact, these braces were invented to assist disabled veterans. Should this rule go into effect, a disabled veteran who has chosen the best brace for their disability is now breaking the law unless they turn in or destroy the firearm, destroy the brace, or pay a $200 tax. This radical policy could make millions of law-abiding citizens into felons overnight. Recently, I led 140 members of Congress to call on the ATF to withdraw this regulation. 48 senators also joined this effort, and we are united in pushing back against this extreme gun control agenda. Moms and dads, sons and daughters, and yes, disabled veterans, every law-abiding American should have the right to protect themselves and exercise their rights as enshrined in our Constitution. That's why I've also been a leader on expanding concealed carry reciprocity across our country. As the author of H.R. 38, the Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act, I'm working to ensure law-abiding concealed carry permit holders do not become criminals when they cross an invisible state line. It's common sense. And due in part to rising crime sweeping our nation, legal gun ownership has reached record highs, making H.R. 38 needed now more than ever. These millions of Americans looking to defend themselves and their families deserve to have their rights respected and protected. Now, I agree with my colleagues who say we must do more to protect our schools and our communities. But the answer is never taking guns away from law-abiding citizens. It's supporting good police officers, hardening our schools, building on the Stop School Violence Act, and investing in mental health care. These are all accomplishments of the last Republican House majority. And I hope my colleagues across the aisle will work with me to build on these solutions, which should be overwhelmingly bipartisan. Together, we can make real change without dismantling the Second Amendment. So I thank Representative Andrew Clyde for your leadership on defending our Second Amendment and for hosting this excellent special order tonight. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much. I commend my colleague from North Carolina, Mr. Hudson, for introducing the Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act, a bill that I'm proud to support as a co-sponsor. And now I recognize my good friend from Texas 22, Representative Nels.
Thank you, sir. Madam Speaker, crime is rising across the country. Double-digit increases in violent crime have been seen in cities across our country, liberal cities no less, that chose to defund their police. This shouldn't be a surprise to anyone here. When you defund the police, you have less police, and less police means more criminals on the streets. Rather than address the poor policy decisions that have led to this increase in violent crime, like defunding police, Democrats are attempting to deflect blame onto gun owners. Law-abiding gun owners in this country are frequently attacked by the radical left as being the source of the gun violence problem. The left wants to tell them what guns they can own and how they should be able to purchase them. And as a former county sheriff, I know firsthand how important gun ownership is. When someone lives in a remote part of the country, they can't afford to wait for 20-minute law enforcement response time in the event of a home invasion. That person needs quick access to a firearm to defend themselves and their loved ones. And that's exactly what legal gun ownership is about, defending one's liberty from would-be attackers. Law-abiding gun owners are not the source of the problem with gun crimes across the country. It's criminals who have no regard for the law. Taking away or limiting a law-abiding citizen's access to legally purchasing a firearm will only hurt law-abiding citizens. We must protect the Second Amendment rights of all Americans. It is a foundational right of our republic and must not be infringed. Republicans in the House must stand firm as the radical left continues their assault. If we lose the Second Amendment, all others will be in jeopardy. Shall not be infringed. It's that simple. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Representative Nels. You are truly a staunch supporter of law enforcement, as am I, and now I recognize my good friend from my home state of Georgia, from Georgia's 1st District, Representative Carter.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Madam Speaker, I rise today to show my support for the Second Amendment and draw attention to its importance. I would like to start by emphasizing a line from the Second Amendment. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Let me repeat that. Shall not be infringed. I emphasize this point because today there are many efforts to infringe and abridge this essential right. There's a lot of misconceptions surrounding the Second Amendment. But let me make it clear. The Second Amendment enshrines the right to self-protection and the defense of liberty for all Americans. The right to protect yourself is not given to us by our government. As part of the Bill of Rights, the Second Amendment was not intended to be comprehensively define the scope of our right to bear arms. Rather, it serves as a prohibition on certain actions our government can take to infringe on that right. The Biden administration, however, misunderstands this point. In a statement last week, the White House stated that the Second Amendment limits the type of people who could own a gun. Further, it continues to seek to restrain Americans' rights through other actions. A recent example is the administration's move to strictly regulate stabilizing braces that have allowed disabled individuals to more easily enjoy their constitutionally protected right. Americans bought 15.1 million guns during the 7-month period from March through September of 2020, which was a 91% leap from the same period in 2019. The FBI also processed more background checks for gun purchases in just the first 9 months of 2020 than it had for any previous full year. Americans want to be safer, and guns give them that sense of security. In spite of that fact, my colleagues across the aisle have made it their mission to restrict this liberty in the name of safety. However, there is no link between the number of guns and gun violence in the U.S. The number of guns in America rose nearly 50% between 1993 and 2013. During the same period, gun homicides fell by nearly 50%. In fact, violent crime has been decreasing for decades despite an increase last year, during which we also saw calls for defunding the police. In 2019, the violent crime rate fell to the second lowest total rate since 1971, and the murder rate was less than half of what it was at the 1980 peak. Restricting the Second Amendment is simply not the answer. This right, preserved in our Constitution generations ago, cannot be taken away from ourselves and future generations. We must protect from intrusions on our right to protect ourselves, no matter how hard the left works to strip us of this principle. I ask all of my colleagues to join me in standing up for our Second Amendment rights to bear arms. Again, I thank the gentleman for yielding, and thank you, Madam Speaker, and I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Carter, for your inspiring words. And I now introduce Representative Thomas Massey from our good state of Kentucky. Madam Speaker, I ask you this. If we grant an 18-year-old individual the right to cast a vote which decides the fate of our nation and can ask them to serve in our armed forces, should we not also grant that individual the right to keep and bear arms, which is granted by the Constitution? I am proud to support a bill introduced by my friend from Kentucky, Mr. Massey, which would restore Second Amendment rights to individuals of voting age. I yield to the good gentleman from Kentucky.
I thank the gentleman from Georgia and appreciate his support, his unwavering support for the Second Amendment. I rise today because just last week, our president of this country spoke about using the nuclear option. He wasn't talking about getting rid of the 60-vote rule in the Senate. He was actually contemplating a nuclear conflagration with the citizens of this country, with the patriots of this country. He said they should get F-15s and nuclear weapons if they wanted to keep this government in check. Those aren't the words of George Washington. Those would be the words of King George. Imagine if a dictator, just imagine the dictator of North Korea or the despot who runs Iran, had muttered or stuttered or uttered these words like our president would and did. There would be an international outcry today to have that dictator removed. We need to hold our chief executive accountable for these words. And our chief executive of this country would do well to understand what the Second Amendment is really about. It is about keeping an overzealous executive in check. It is about securing all of the other liberties in this Constitution. It is about the patriots who are willing to tell the government, we are in charge. And with that, I yield back to the gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you so very much, Representative Massey, and for those inspiring words. I now yield to the good gentleman from Texas 21, Representative Chip Roy.
I thank the gentleman from Georgia, and I appreciate his conviction and his dedication to this issue and getting this floor time for all of us to share that. I appreciate the remarks from my friend and the gentleman from Kentucky, and I couldn't agree more, right, about how offensive what we heard from the President of the United States with respect to our Second Amendment protected rights, and then coming in and talking about the foolishness of our desire to have our Second Amendment rights protected when, in fact, we'd be up against F-15s and potential nuclear weapons. Imagine the absurdity of having the President of the United States say that. And meanwhile, I live in Austin, Texas, where currently crime rates are skyrocketing. Murder rates almost double. Why might that be? The President of the United States gave a speech allegedly about crime. Did he talk about the defunding of police? Did he talk about the $150 million stripped out of the budget in Austin, Texas? How about Oakland right now? Doubling down on their foolish defunding of the police. It wasn't enough to take $15 million out of it last time, and now seeing murder rates skyrocket, they're now doubling down for another $16 million. They think that's going to solve their problems. The genius of the current administration, my Democrats on the other side of the aisle, is to take police off the streets and then come after our Second Amendment rights. How about the border of Texas? The border of Texas is wide open with cartels operating fully from the Gulf of Mexico all the way up through Big Bend. They have operational control of our border. We have images of gunmen coming across the Rio Grande. We have humans being sold into sex trafficking and human trafficking. We have 7,500 pounds of fentanyl pouring across our border. Americans dying in this opioid epidemic. We have Americans in danger. And what do Democrats want to do? Take away our Second Amendment rights to defend ourselves as they defund police and empower cartels. That is your Democratic Party, ladies and gentlemen. They want you to be in danger. They want you to have to suffer the consequences of their rote incompetence and disbelief in your ability to take care of your own families and your own communities. The President of the United States actually said the other day that, in fact, that you're not allowed to have a cannon, he said. Well, you know what? In Texas, There was a moment when we had a cannon and we looked at the Mexicans and we said, come and take it, in 1835. And that is what I say to the President of the United States. Come and take it, because it's our Second Amendment rights, and we're going to defend ourselves. And when he asks why we need 20 rounds of ammo, maybe it's because he's saying that he wants to come after the American people with F-15s and nuclear weapons. I yield back.
Thank you to the gentleman from Texas 21 for his passionate defense of our Second Amendment rights. And now I yield to the gentleman from Florida 18, Representative Mast.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Madam Speaker, I would just say this. Number one, I think you would do well to turn off the phone and pay attention to this special order while you have the honor of presiding over the floor of the House of Representatives. The words being spoken are important here. And I would just share a brief anecdote with you. And it's this. I spent many nights in combat, and like many of my friends, helmet, night vision optics, lots of Velcro, camo, backpack. I was a bomb technician, so I normally carried, 30, 40 pounds of explosives. I had my sidearm, I had my carbine, I had a metal detector and a number of other things. I normally had about 10 magazines across the front of my vest. And we were heavy. We were carrying a lot of weight on any given night. And every single night, both myself and my brothers in arms would decide how many more magazines we were going to put into our backpacks, into our kits. Because we always felt that the dumbest reason for any of us to die would to be for a lack of shooting back. And I think that's something that would in turn be one of the dumbest reasons for any law-abiding American to bring about their death would be because they can't shoot back. That's right. And I yield back to the gentleman.
Thank you so much for those inspiring words. As a fellow combat veteran, I honor your service and I honor your speech this evening. And I now yield to the gentle lady from New York's 22nd District, Representative Tenney, who sent out an amicus brief, and I was proud to co-sponsor that brief. So thank you very much for defending our Second Amendment in that brief. And I yield to you.
Thank you, Mr. Clyde, and thank you for hosting this great special order on a fundamental right. Madam Speaker, our Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms for self-protection is a fundamental right protected by the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. However, many states, including my own home state of New York, home to Remington Arms, of all places, unconstitutionally restricts our right to carry concealed outside of our home. In most New York jurisdictions, an applicant must justify their need for such a concealed carry permit. Despite the plain words of the Second Amendment enshrined for centuries in the Bill of Rights, state and local authorities in New York continue to reject applications for law-abiding Americans for entirely arbitrary reasons or for no reason at all. States like California and Massachusetts do exactly the same thing. This arbitrary standard must be rejected. That's why I'm leading the amicus brief for an upcoming U.S. Supreme Court case, New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Corlett. This case will decide if New York's burdensome concealed carry law violates the Second Amendment. A little background on the case. In 2016, Rensselaer County, New York officials denied the concealed carry permit of Robert Nash for the purpose of self-defense. And later in 2018, they also denied the concealed carry application of Brandon Koch for the same reason. Both these individuals are honorable, upstanding, and law-abiding citizens. They met every requirement of New York's rigorous concealed carry license applications. These two men simply applied for a concealed carry permit for personal protection after a rash of robberies in their neighborhoods and their community. New York State is now witnessing the highest crime rate that we have had in the history of our state. However, even after all of that, the county licensing officers did not believe that self-defense was a valid exercise of constitutional rights under the Second Amendment. The gun control measures being considered by the Supreme Court in this key case amount to a blanket ban on the right to keep and bear arms outside the home. The amicus brief I'm submitting, with the support of more than 50 members of the House of Representatives so far, defends citizens' rights against elected officials and government bureaucrats who are attempting to deny these fundamental constitutional rights to all Americans. We argue that it is unconstitutional for the government to apply a balancing test for a fundamental right such as the Second Amendment under our Constitution. The Bill of Rights was drafted and passed to protect citizens from government overreach. It is worth noting that New York is an original colony with a very strong history of citizens who stood up for our basic rights. In 1789 and 1788, of course, as well, before, during the Constitutional Convention and the founding of our federal Constitution, New York's leaders refused to sign on to our federal Constitution until the Bill of Rights was added to our founding document. They knew how important Second Amendment rights were then and how important they were to a self-governing constitutional republic such as ours. The success of the plaintiff, law-abiding gun owners in this case, will end this improper interpretation of our constitutional right to keep and bear arms and will be the first major pro-Second Amendment decision considered by the U.S. Supreme Court since Heller versus the District of Columbia. Madam Speaker, I urge all members who take their oath to uphold the Constitution seriously to sign on to this amicus brief. Together, we can all protect our Second Amendment rights for all Americans. And I again want to thank Mr. Clyde for your tenacious advocacy on behalf of our God-given constitutional rights and all of my colleagues here today who are standing up for all Americans. I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady from New York for her inspiring words and her work on this very important amicus brief. I now yield to the gentlelady from Colorado's 3rd District, a fiery defender of our Second Amendment because she knows exactly what's at stake. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much to my friend and the gentleman from Georgia, Andrew Clyde, for putting this together. Madam Speaker, I want to begin this evening by thanking my Democrat colleagues for their outstanding work in encouraging millions of Americans to celebrate their Second Amendment rights by purchasing their first, second, or even 100th firearm. From the left's riots in cities across America to Biden's threats to strip away our basic constitutional rights, Democrats are single-handedly responsible for the sale of tens of millions of firearms. Bravo. Well done. And I hear that the interest has begun to peak when it comes to the sale of F-15s. Now, I have some questions for these freedom haters. When are you going to call on the chief executive, the basement dweller, to hold his own son accountable for his gun crimes? Hunter Biden lied on a federal firearms application, which is punishable by up to 10 years and a $250,000 fine, of which 10% will not be going to the big guy. Rules for thee, but not for my crackhead, Parmesan-smoking gun criminal son. What about the disposal of Hunter Biden's gun in a back alley dumpster? And why was the Secret Service involved in locating this firearm? Can you just imagine for half a second if Donald Trump Jr. was involved in firearms crimes and his dad ordered the Secret Service to cover it up? That's just the start of the hypocrisy. Biden will call widely purchased firearms weapons of war, but then he'll tell you that you need an F-15 or a nuke to keep the federal government in check. He will target so-called merchants of death, but celebrate the 600 abortion clinics across America. This regime will encourage riots, defund the police, and try to take away Americans' right to self-defense. Madam Speaker, the American people are not on board with the Biden regime's hypocritical gun grabbing. Instead, they are buying guns at a record rate. So my colleagues from the other side, they can keep running their mouths, and we will keep adding to our arsenals. Thank you, gentlemen. I yield back.
Thank you to the gentlelady from Colorado's 3rd District for her excellent remarks and reminding us of the investigation that needs to be initiated on the purchase of a firearm by Hunter Biden on a 4473 that was not filled out correctly, which is a violation of the law. And I now yield to the gentleman from the great state of Pennsylvania, from Pennsylvania's 10th District, Representative Perry.
Well, I thank the gentleman for hosting us this evening, and every single person here laments the crime that is occurring in our country, the people that lose their lives to crime. Every single one of us laments that, especially when it comes from the inability to defend yourself or your family. It's unacceptable. It's horrific. Unfortunately, my friends on the other side of the aisle, the Democrats, want to defund the police and disarm America, essentially destroying the Constitution. Now, they'll tell you it's all about safety because they, too, lament these lost lives as we do. But, ladies and gentlemen, it's not really about safety. It's about control. It's about control. Now, there's a country close to us, has pretty strict gun control. There's one gun store in the country to our south, one, where you can buy a gun legally, in the country of Mexico. And their homicide rate is 5-6 times what the United States is. And remember, we lament every single lost life, especially those where people cannot defend themselves. But that's what this is about. They want to destroy, my friends on the other side of the aisle want to destroy the Constitution to control you. Now, like I said, we lament every single lost life. Well, Mexico, you can barely not own a firearm legally, 5-6 times the murder rate. What's happening in the United States of America? We're defunding the police and taking the rights and the ability of law-abiding citizens away from them to defend themselves in these cities: Chicago, New York City, Baltimore, Los Angeles, Detroit. Strictest gun control in America. It's actually worse there than it is in Mexico. It's actually worse there. 10 times the homicide rate. Ladies and gentlemen, do not let the federal government take your rights away. The Constitution says this right shall not be infringed upon. I come from Pennsylvania, and it says the right to defend yourself. The right to defend yourself, the right to bear arms and defend yourself shall not be questioned. We're not going to allow it to be questioned here. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from the great state of Pennsylvania for reminding us of how tremendously important the Second Amendment is. And I now yield to my good friend and colleague from Virginia's 5th District, Representative Bob Good.
Thank you very much, Representative Clyde. Thank you, Madam Speaker. The right to keep and bear arms for self-defense and to ensure we remain a free people is a God-given right, not a government-bestowed privilege. We are, however, privileged to live in a country whose founders correctly and appropriately recognized this God-given right and codified it in the highest law of the land, the Constitution. The wording of the Second Amendment is assumptive in nature. The right to keep and bear arms is assumed to already exist, and our founders merely provided legal clarity and protection that it not be infringed. Government officials have no right. Government officials who do not right, government officials who do right and follow the Constitution have nothing to fear from an armed citizenry. However, government officials who oppress their people and violate their constitutional oath and the rights guaranteed by that Constitution for the people should rightly fear those people. As has been said, when people fear the government, there is tyranny. When the government fears the people, there is liberty. But this administration believes that the greatest threat to our country is its own people, its own citizens. This is what oppressive regimes say. And this administration never misses an opportunity to attack the Second Amendment by seeking to tax and regulate away our constitutional rights. They've banned law-abiding citizens and licensed firearm dealers. They've blamed law-abiding citizens and licensed firearm dealers for the recent surge in violent crime in Democrat-run cities. They've nominated a gun-grabbing radical named David Chipman to lead the ATF. And President Biden has himself repeatedly belittled gun owners and their belief that the right to bear arms is essential to freedom. But President Biden's opinion does not change the Constitution or the Second Amendment. In fact, with Biden's crime surge, Biden's border surge, and Democrat efforts to weaken and undermine law enforcement, it's no wonder someone recently said to me, "I carry a gun because I can't carry a cop." Thomas Jefferson once wrote, What country can preserve its liberties if its rulers are not warned from time to time that their people preserve the spirit of resistance? Let them take arms. The Second Amendment protects all other rights and freedoms. As my friend Chip Roy from Texas said last week at an event we were at together, we will live free. The Second Amendment is critical to ensuring that we live free. And I yield back.
I thank the good gentleman and my good friend, Representative Good from Virginia, for his inspiring words. As previously noted, Madam Speaker, the Biden administration has issued a proposed rule that would misinterpret the law and criminalize pistols with stabilizing braces. My friend from Virginia, Mr. Good, has introduced legislation to right this wrong and provide clear and accurate definitions for both rifles and pistols to avoid infringing on individual Second Amendment rights, and that is H.R. 3823. And with that, I now recognize my good friend from Alabama's 2nd District, Representative Barry Moore.
Thank you, Representative Clyde. We appreciate your leadership on this. Madam Speaker, recent remarks by President Joe Biden about the Second Amendment have troubled me and millions of other Americans who own firearms. I think they should trouble people on both sides of the aisle. I also believe his remarks and attitudes towards gun owners should trouble all freedom-loving Americans, regardless of whether they own a gun. You see, President Biden's comments about restricting the Second Amendment show a fundamental misunderstanding of the relationship between this nation's government and its people. President Biden believes that the American people get their rights from government. Our founders would strongly disagree. In fact, they were so skeptical of powerful central government that they created an innovative and remarkable system of checks and balances to protect its citizens from a tyrannical government. As it was so eloquently phrased in the Declaration of Independence, and I quote, "To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed." End quote. What powers our government possesses was given to it by the people, not the other way around. And we gave these powers to the government to protect the rights we hold dear. The Second Amendment does not apply to a particular firearm. It does not specify an AR-15, nor does it list a musket or a bayonet. It didn't have to, because the Second Amendment protects a right that you already have, the right to bear arms. There is no need to continually update the Second Amendment. Madam Speaker, the Second Amendment is not a permission slip, but an assurance that no law will be enacted to strip American people of their fundamental right. The language of the Second Amendment is clear, and it says, "The right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." This right was so important to the founders that they would not enact the Constitution without the Second Amendment's inclusion in the Bill of Rights. President Biden's remarks betray the flawed reasoning of so many on the Democratic Party who insist that the government is the grantor of rights. It is not the grantor, but the guarantor, the protector. The government simply cannot grant rights given to us by God. It protects those God-given rights. Americans should be skeptical of any philosophy asserting that the government can restrict the rights we have been given and the power to protect those. If they take your guns, what is next? The right to trial by lawyer, maybe free speech, the right to worship who and how we choose. Madam Speaker, for the American people to keep the liberty we hold dear, our constitutional protections, all of them, must be maintained. Thomas Jefferson said it this way. He said, "When people fear the government, there is tyranny. But when the government fears people, there is liberty." Thank you, and I yield back.
And I thank the good gentleman from Alabama for those inspiring remarks. And now I want to talk about privately made firearms, which I briefly referenced in my introductory remarks. Undeniably, the Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms, has been fundamental to the freedom and security of our nation since it was first founded in 1776. It is the teeth behind so many of the other rights and liberties we enjoy. We know this to be true because history has shown us that when the right to keep and bear arms falls, then the right of free speech and of the free press falls immediately after. From our very beginning until today, for almost 250 years, people have always been able to build their own firearms. But that right is at risk, considering the White House's gun control agenda. Under the Gun Control Act of 1968, commercial firearm manufacturers, importers, firearm distributors, and retail firearm dealers had to get federal government licenses in order to continue to operate their businesses. Along with those licenses came record-keeping requirements and compliance inspections to ensure they followed the new laws and regulations. This effectively put almost all firearm manufacturers and importers under the direct control of the federal government. History also tells us, Madam Speaker, that after registration comes confiscation. We saw it happen in Russia after the 1917 Communist Revolution, in Nazi Germany in 1938, in Australia in 1996, and most recently in New Zealand in 2019. In those countries, national registration led to eventual confiscation. Now the ATF wants even privately made firearms under their total control to make component parts like upper housings and slides, those parts that can hold a firing pin or a bolt carrier. To make those simple parts into a serialized firearm will have a chilling effect on privately made firearms. In fact, it could completely eliminate privately made firearms, finally placing all manufacture of firearms under complete government control. Those fears are genuinely based, and we see that today with ATF trying to legislate by redefining the meaning of words or creating new ones that don't even exist in the written law. As I noted earlier in the hour, Madam Speaker, I share the passion of my Democrat colleagues in keeping firearms out of the hands of criminals, but in achieving that shared goal, we cannot trample on the Second Amendment rights of citizens. And if the ATF succeeds in pushing these new definitions across the finish line, Madam Speaker, I fear that we will be opening the floodgates to allowing the agency to regulate our God-given Second Amendment rights right out of existence. I don't plan to allow that to happen, not on my watch, Madam Speaker. And I don't think my colleagues who filled these seats earlier plan to allow that to happen either. Together with the support of the American people, we will never give 1 inch in the defense of the Second Amendment. And with that, I yield to my good friend from Kansas's 1st District, Mr. Tracy Mann, who introduced H.R. 1758, the Home Defense and Competitive Shooting Act of 2021. I recognize Mr. Mann.
Thank you, Congressman. And thank you for hosting this important special hour to highlight a basic right that we all share and love and that makes us who we are as Americans. I rise tonight to discuss President Biden's misuse of the executive order and its harmful impact on law-abiding citizens. In 1789, George Washington penned the first executive order directing the heads of his departments to submit reports in their operations. In 1957, my fellow Kansan, Dwight D. Eisenhower, used the executive order to send federal troops to integrate public schools in Little Rock, Arkansas. Nearly every United States president has issued executive orders like these to instruct the government how to work within the parameters set by the Congress and the Constitution until now. In his first 10 days as president, Joe Biden issued 25 executive orders, more than the last 7 presidents combined in their first 10 days. And the list continues to grow. Today, we're up to nearly 60 executive orders and more executive actions and memoranda than I care to count. The power to issue executive orders is derived from Article 2, Section 3 of the Constitution, which states that the President shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. When orders are based in facts and stakeholder engagement, like those we saw with Washington and Eisenhower, they work well and they store the executive execution of said laws. When the power to issue an executive order is abused, though, used to stronghand the minority or circumvent Congress, the orders become a dangerous tool to undermine the American people and our democracy. This is what is happening right now. President Biden recently penned 6 anti-Second Amendment executive actions in one day, banning handmade guns altogether, defining a pistol as a short-barreled rifle, allowed for more intense regulation, and mandated a report on gun gifting and trading. In a recent interview on gun control, a spokesperson for President Biden stated, "The President will not wait for Congress to act before the administration takes our own steps, fully within the administration's authority and the Second Amendment." We can no longer sit idle and watch dozens of executive orders from a single administration attempt to dictate the direction of our country with no input from this Congress. Congress was created to legislate. Governing by executive order is not legislating. That's why I introduced H.R. 716, the More Accountability is Necessary Now Act, requiring executive branch to notify the American public and this Congress with its intent to issue any new executive order or revoking any executive order that pertains to our Second Amendment rights. I also introduced H.R. 1758, the Home Defense and Competitive Shooting Act, pushing back on President Biden's intent to redefine pistols as short-barreled rifles and eliminating the prohibition on transporting short-barreled rifles in interstate commerce. I invite my colleagues to co-sponsor both these pieces of legislation as we stand up against any efforts, including shameful executive overreach, to diminish or weaken the rights of law-abiding Americans to own, carry, and use firearms. The Second Amendment is a load-bearing wall in our Constitution. If you weaken a load-bearing wall, it's bad for the entire structure. We must and we will push back against the relentless attacks on our Second Amendment rights. I yield back, and thank you again for hosting this.
Thank you, Representative Mann. While any infringement of our Second Amendment right is unconstitutional, policymakers have imposed even stricter regulations on some type of firearms, particularly short-barreled rifles, and I truly appreciate my friend from Kansas's 1st District correcting this by introducing the Home Defense and Competitive Shooting Act of 2021, which will accurately classify short-barreled rifles as semi-automatic rifles, as they should be. They should be semi-automatic rifles and only semi-automatic rifles, and regulate them as such. With that, Madam Speaker, I thank you for affording my colleagues and I the opportunity to stand before you today in defense of the Second Amendment and to highlight common sense, conservative-led proposals to protect and preserve our rights. Madam Speaker, I also want to thank each of my colleagues for their participation this evening. Their respective constituents should be proud to have such staunch defenders of the Second Amendment representing them in the People's House. Though several of my colleagues who have introduced proposals could not join us tonight, the American people should know that the solutions highlighted in the last hour are not exhaustive of our efforts to restore, protect, and preserve our God-given right to keep and bear arms. Rather, the solutions presented tonight are just the tip of the iceberg. Madam Speaker, I again reiterate to you my sincere hope that the American people will take the opportunity to share their thoughts with the ATF on the 2 proposed regulations that I mentioned, as you can see on this board right here, as they have the potential to upend not only the firearms manufacturing industry, but also the legality of guns in homes across the country as we know it. My constituents sent me to Congress to do everything in my power to protect and uphold the Constitution, and I plan to do just that, so long as they entrust me with their voting card. And so with that, Madam Speaker, I yield back.